It's lovely to see each one of you. This little reflection and our conversation together, at least in my mind, is a bit of a requiem. And I hope it doesn't hang in the shadow of nostalgia, but rather moves us into a place of remembering. Remembering requiems often have a kind of sadness that flows over them. But that sadness is obviously because of a relationship, because of gifts, because of treasured time together. So in this month in review, the conversation will roam a little bit from the local, that is, I expect why most of you are here, which is a realization that that little modest house, 600 square feet at most, where Chester Ronning made his home, has been bulldozed. What that means for memory, what it means for our sense of place and where we live. But it'll roam from that to, of course, larger issues as well, of how our world is riven by war and by systematic displacement. So there are questions that come to my mind. Are we blind to the removal of the memory that is in our own midst? The ground we walk on, the places we pass by? Do we see a kind of appetite for clear cutting the built memory of local and regional communities? And what is the cost of that? Do local communities, do governments, universities, international agencies have any responsibility for what I have often called for many years the spread of cultural amnesia? I sometimes think we're in a period where culturally we are experiencing what individuals experience when their mind is captured by the diseases of dementia. At a gathering of the Church of England prelates just prior to his death, the great English historian Henry Chadwick was heard to murmur, "The saddest thing in the world is a person who has lost his memory. Sadder still, an institution that has lost its memory." And I would add, what of a community that has lost its memory? I've seen the destruction of memory in kind of vivid ways in Kosovo, where I was just before the war, in Serbia, in Sarajevo, in Syria, among all those Christian communities in the Levant, which are now reduced to not only minorities, but many not existing. And of course, today, we see Ukraine. We see what is happening there. And a couple of days ago, some of us listened to Mr. Putin speak about his vision of that world. And for anyone who has been alert in cameras over the last number of years, we have seen the effort to help us become aware of how the memory of indigenous peoples for whom this land has been home, how that memory has been so deeply compromised. I want to dedicate this a little bit to Wendy Cassidy, in part because Wendy, of course, was married to Noel, Chester Roning's grandson. And she lived about 5 houses from Chester Roning's house. And she would come down every afternoon and she would type Chester's book that he finally published about his sojourn in China. And I think of her today. She left this world on the 11th of May in 2018. The Swedes have a lovely term. It's called himmelblinde, home blindness. And I was introduced to this term by my wonderful Swedish colleague of blessed memory, Per-Uno Agren, when he came over here and we spent time in the Swedish community at just north of Camrose in in the Vilhelmina district with the church there. And we wandered that ground and spoke to many people there. And I realized that my work, my field research work in the museum for many years, where I spent time with various refugee communities, immigrant communities, seeking to be led by the hand into their cultural memory, led by the hand into their living tradition, led by the hand into their sense of place, which now included Canada. It was always 2 or 3 places, and Canada the most recent, led by the hand into their historical experience. On May 26th, 2020, the University of Alberta Board of Finance and Property Committee met and prepared the way for what they call the disposition of land, Roning House, 4606, 49th Street, Camrose, Lot 15, Block 10, Plan 3605U. And as some of you know, I suspect that property was sold by the university for $90,000, an amount that I suspect is very close to what it costs Augustana every year for toilet paper. The garage was salvaged by one of people in Camrose, moved, I think, to his farm. And then that very modest house was bulldozed. A new large home will be raised on that ground. And my sense is it's the application for this new home that gave rise to some second thought. I should also mention that the owners of the Roning homestead in Valhalla in the Peace River, and that homestead was designated by the Historic Sites Service many years ago, that the owner is seeking to have it decertified so that that can be dealt with in terms of modern real estate values. It is common in our society to think of homes where people have lived and moved and had their being by this curious word, real estate. When I heard that the demolisher had arrived, a number of thoughts crossed my mind. Of course, as I think probably all of you know, it was a great pleasure for me when I was asked as the director of the Roning Center if I would move in to the Roning House. And it was lovely because I wanted a place on the Augustana campus or nearby where we could gather, because I had a memory of Chester Ronning, and I knew what it meant for people to gather in his home. So it was a wonderful thing to be able to gather there in that very small and modest space. And small and modest, if that hasn't become the direction to which we need to move, I have no idea what direction we're going to move in. So we gathered there in that space and we talked about, and with so many people that we had the pleasure of inviting from around the world, listened to them, learned from them, and thought together. And in my modest shaping of the work of the Ronning Center around three spheres, around working with universities, and that did not in my mind mean the U of A solely, it meant all universities in this part of the world. Working carefully in the public square to bring together people of deep difference. And working also with religious communities, because of course, issues of religion in public life have their traction in religious communities, evangelicals, fundamentalists, Muslim communities in our day, many of them riven by serious, deep difference. And thus, the need to redouble our efforts to talk and think together and to build relationships together. The Ronning Center, of course, as some of you may know, was a pilgrimage site. One of the things that happens in geopolitical issues around the world is that pilgrimage sites, when they become contested, become the objects of war. And I don't mean to make any equivalencies here by any means, not at all, but only that when we pick away at the landscape of human memory, we also prepare the way for something. We see that from the way history has unfolded. I was so delighted not long after moving into the Ronning house there in Camrose, moving the Ronning Center in there, that I got a call from the People's Republic of China consulate in Calgary, from the consulate general, who spoke lovely English and who told me he had done his MA on American literature, much to my astonishment. I knew things were changing in China as well when I heard that. And that he wanted to come up and bring his staff and to see the Ronning house. So I talked with the dean. I laid in a bottle of aquavit frozen in a lump of, or a large container of ice with some spruce branches in it. Got a little herring. Now I know that Chester Ronning probably never drank aquavit, or certainly didn't use it as a chaser for pickled herring. But I also knew that that was the patrimony of his and my father's background, both coming from a similar place in Norway. So they came up and pulled up and came in and walked around. Didn't take long. And then talked about what the man whose presence was still there meant to their country. And then he said, we would like to go to his grave. And they, of course, brought flowers. And we drove over to the cemetery where many of your relatives lie, where both my parents lie. And we went and stood at his and his wife's grave. And each of them, beginning with the consulate general, stood in front of the grave, bowed, kept their head bowed for some time, and then raised their head. And the next one came and bowed. The Ranin House has been a pilgrimage site for Chinese for many years, since they could travel to this country. I had talks with Roger Epp soon after being appointed as the director of the Ranin Center about the Ranin House and about its significance as a place of memory, as a place of remembering. We discussed the possibility of turning the Ranin House into a kind of Ranin study center, having an exhibition in it associated with his work. Because as you know, he was a bit of a sculptor, and Mrs. Ranin was a quite good oil painter. We talked of it as a place where his work and his life could be exhibited a little bit, but where students could sit and breathe in the presence of that and engage some of the great questions that Chester Ranin engaged and worked on. I recall Tom Radford, who made the NFB film called China Mission, which some of you no doubt have seen. Tom was a neighbor of mine, and I talked with him about Chester Ranin many, many years ago, many years before he had made the film, because I knew he was at the NFB. And then he made the film, and he told me about being there, spending several days there with Chester. And Tom had a small child born to him, I think 3-year-old at the time. And he talked with such delight about Ranin taking that 3-year-old in his arms with his chopsticks in his other arms as he was making a Chinese meal, which was his normal fare for them to eat later on, and the kind of delight and presence that exuded from that place. The thought that Roger and I had talked about a little bit faded, of course, as new opportunities arose. The building of the library and the student facilities, wonderful additions to the campus, refurbishing of Old Main, the building of the Arts Center, the refurbishing of the Bailey's Theater, all of which I'm sure you have supported and lauded. Seems to me that part of remembering, part of our time is the way in which we are, I don't think well, maybe this is to place it too finely. We are kind of addicted to the new, to what we see as progress. And of course, in general in the society, inclined to see the past as a weight around our neck. Why? Why is that so? What all has gone into that? What is its costs? Chester Ranin was born in China, of course, and he was born on December 13th, 1894. And Brian Evans, his biographer, spoke of him as Chinese. He only looked Norwegian. He only looked like a Lutheran. I argued with him a bit about this, suggesting to him that he was in fact also deeply Norwegian Lutheran, deeply influenced by that life movement that spread throughout Norway 250 years ago, called Pietism, a movement which, like Luther himself, worked for the transformation of Norway when 75–80% of the Norwegian population had been reduced to serfdom, to penury by the king and the church and a few Norwegian wealthy people. Chester Ranin breathed his last on the 31st of December, 1984. I saw him last in 1967 when we buried my father at the cemetery there, and then came across to Hovland's funeral home on the main drag into Camrose for a little reception. Arnold and Nellie Hovland and my parents were dear friends for a long time. So we went over there after we laid my father in the ground, and in comes that tall, elegant man. And he sits down by me and he says, "David, I haven't seen you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Let's talk." It's a wonderful memory. But he breathed his last in 1984. And in his Gethsemane time, the first language he lost, as many of you know, he was a polyglot. The first language he lost was English. The next language he lost was Norwegian. And at the end, he spoke Chinese. So why do we remember him? Why, at least for some of us, a little grief at the wiping away of his home? Well, there are a range of things, and I won't go into them, but I just want to pull them up a little bit, as is only appropriate when we think of somebody who has been significant and dear to us. He, of course, was born in China, but then he returned as a missionary in 1922 to 27. And then, of course, he became the principal of Camrose Lutheran College, a position he held for 15 years. And in 1942, he did his master's dissertation, making an argument for how the university, or the University of Alberta, which held the reins on this issue of which universities get to give degrees. He was the first one that I know of who argued that Protestant private schools, such as Camrose Lutheran College, ought to have that capacity. That capacity, of course, didn't come about until Glenn Johnson's tenure, and Augustana moved finally to become part of the University of Alberta. And then we remember his political interests, his involvement in the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation Party, leader of the CCF for a period of time, elected briefly to the legislature, and then wiped out in an election along with all of his other candidates from that party. But what, of course, stands out so significantly is his posting to China in 1945 to 1951. It's significant because, as all of you know, Canada retained its relationship to China through the revolution. Our American friends severed their relationship with China, in part because in America it became illegal to be a communist, a member of the Communist Party, but that never happened in Canada. We're so nice in this country, you know, so nice. Why was he chosen? Well, Chester Ronning was completely inappropriate in terms of the history of the diplomatic service in Canada. Up to his time, there are virtually no diplomats chosen in Canada who are not Roman Catholic and French, or Anglican and English and Scots. That was the diplomatic service in Canada. Chester Ronning, I'm not absolutely certain about this, but I think he is the first of a person chosen from the wrong tribe, a Lutheran, a Norwegian, and the wrong place. a modest, little, humble town in Alberta. But why was he chosen? Well, he was chosen, as Brian Evans said, because he was Chinese. Because if my memory serves me, Canada's great economist from Nova Scotia had the ear of the President of the United States and of the Prime Minister of Canada, and pointed out that there was this person in Camrose who had all the gifts necessary to go to China and to see if we can't well, in Ukraine, they're experiencing this today. If we can't pull life from death, he also spent time in Norway. That was the gift he was given by the diplomatic service, mainly because his lovely wife, who found so much of life a bit of a struggle, she really wanted to go to Norway. So he was appointed there from 54 to 57, and then to India, 57 to 64, in the United Nations, was in an international commission to Korea in 54, and Laos in 61, 62. And then, of course, one that touched me closely, Hanoi, a special mission undertaken to Hanoi in the midst of the Vietnam War, 1965 and 66, under President Johnson. I was in the United States, subject to the draft, the American draft, and being sent off to Vietnam. You don't lose any votes for Canadians as cannon fodder. We remember all of these matters with him. And it's so interesting to me that he and his way of being were treasured in China. And they were treasured so much that just before his 90th birthday, he was invited by the People's Republic of China to come to the Great Hall of the People. And they had a state gathering and party for him there. Not long, a few months before he left this world. So I remember, and many of you knew him better than I, he bounced me on his knee a few times, told me some stories of China. But I remember him with fondness and what he has meant there. So when I got the phone call and heard that the house was demolished, it wasn't a shock to me. I knew the physical issues with the house that framed the discussion, because I had that discussion also with Dean Berger. I argued that there is nothing that can't be done in this house. It costs so little compared to what it means. I've had a lot to do with the Historic Site Service, so I do know a little bit about this on the ground. I also know that China, the Chinese government, was interested. To say nothing about Noel and Wendy Cassidy, perhaps others. It simply took interest and a willingness to have a discussion about it. So what is the cost? What is the cost of removing memory and its touchstones from our world? I will finish with just, you may not have seen what I sent out, which is a little from my commonplace book, several texts on place. So let me give you two of those, and then we can think and talk together about the implications of this kind of action. The first one is this. Knowing a little of the past brought with it the first sense of belonging. And I would say knowing a little of the present does that too. In 1954, Martin Heidegger wrote an influential essay called Building, Dwelling, Thinking, in which he explores the close connection between the three ings, building, dwelling, thinking, of his title, a connection emphasized by his mannered omission of commas. He takes as his example a 200-year-old farmhouse in the Black Forest. Such a place, he says, combined religious beliefs, domestic life, and local topography. And here's the key. Here, the self-sufficiency of the power to let earth and heaven, divinities and mortals enter in simple oneness into things, ordered the house. At the Ronning House, the self-sufficiency of the power to let earth and the local world and the heavens, which he had come to deeply appreciate from his time in China, where the emperor had been considered a heavenly emissary. Divinities and mortals enter in simple oneness into things and order the house. For Heidegger, dwelling and to dwell is linked to the verb to be. If you do not dwell someplace, how can you be? And a second one, nobody is capable of living only in space. Everyone lives also in place. And I think of the Augustana campus, what we know of it. I think of the neighborhood, those who live there and treasure it, how they seek to make it a thick place. Everyone lives also in place. This is because being human means, all attempts to the contrary notwithstanding, to be in a physical body, and the body is necessarily tied to a place. I know people who said to me they can still see Chester striding his long stride down that street towards the campus. Human experience, for that reason, evolves in specific local places. Some points in space, as a result, are always more important to people than others, since they have been the scenes of individual and collective imagination and action. So having a memory related to others, participating in a larger story, calls for involvement, requires presence. That larger story, that geopolitical story that linked this little place, Camrose, with China and the unfolding of the second half of the 20th century. And these locations are in turn imbued with experience, past and present. They become places of density. Therefore, certain places have a special thickness for certain people. It is there that the ancestors walked the earth, and I would add, our relatives and friends, those we knew walked there, but maybe did not know personally, whose spirit we sense. It is there that the ancestors walked the earth, and the relative memories are at home. It is there that one is tied into a web of social bonds, and where one recognizes and is recognized by others, including the Chinese consulate, who was substantially younger than me, with a rich memory. And it is there that people share a particular vantage point. And this is worth thinking about. A particular vantage point, and that language, habit, and outlook combine to constitute a particular style of being in the world. That style of being, which Chester Ronnie embodied, and which was such a pleasure for me while living in that house, to gather many of you with those people who were strangers, but where common concerns led to common thinking. That style of being also requires place. So, I remember and am grateful. I have sorrow and am grateful. That street is a different street now, but we can remember. It is so curious to me, so curious, that a university, think of it, a university sells it for $90,000. That a heritage board, that a city council, all lovely, good people, capable, some of which have sat on boards of the university and other boards, do not see. Home blindness, himmelblinde. I have plenty of it too. So, enough from me. I'm happy to have any of you speak who would like to.
David, I have brief memories of seeing Chester Ronning walking the streets of Camrose. In my younger days, I only came here as a young lawyer, and with a new family and whatnot. So I never ever introduced myself, though I passed him on the one day and nodded to him. That was my experience of him, but I certainly followed some of his doings at that time, especially during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the questions I have, and to me, it was a big surprise to find the house bulldozed down. I had heard nothing about it. I knew nothing about it. I just can't understand why there was no discussion about this or anything. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know what the big backdrop is. It's what I've been talking about. It's home blindness.
Mm-hmm.
It's institutions that no longer have a memory and are preoccupied with that which is new. And so we don't treasure our own. And the problem with that, and we have to be cautious about it. The great Canadian philosopher George Grant argued that that caring for one's own is the ground for caring for others and for the difference of others. Chester Ronning grew up in China. His parents and his grandparents were Lutheran missionaries there. He had a kind of tribal caring for his own, which was immediate, which probably was the ground that made it possible for him to engage the Chinese and Chinese language and culture with such vigor and such delight. But when you don't care for your own, you will have an ideology that tells you to be kind to other people, to, all that sort of thing. But your capacity to engage others withers if you have not been able to deeply engage your own. The danger of only engaging your own, of course, is another kind of tribalism, and terrible. But it is a mistake to assume, as much of our letters has done, and much of our universities have been teaching, that you must strip human culture in order to make a human being fit for engaging others. This is a horrific notion that has been in the saddle now with the advent of postmodernism for the last 50 years. So the process was simply a real estate process. Could it have been foreshortened? Well, of course it could have been. It would simply require people that have positions, deans, members of boards, counselors, or popular movements. Popular movements can do things too, but that's not the way it normally works in this society. So that the only thing at the table was this unfortunate little piece of property, which we need to get rid of. It'll cost too much money to change it. It's just not worth it. Well, that depends on what you think memory is worth and what you think a place which is a place of the presence of that memory and the events that it holds is worth for those that are young and those that are to come. So I think it is a remarkable leadership failure. But I certainly saw it coming. So, I saw it coming when I was there. The reason I left. But it's sad. You've all become Quakers. I'm sorry to do that to you. Requiems, you know, are usually followed by wakes, where you can tell your story.
David, let me ask you something, or just push you a little bit on something you just said.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi. If that place, I mean, what you just said has been exquisitely phrased, just beautiful. If that place is seen only in terms of a financial matter, real estate, like you said, and the finances involved are minuscule. I mean, it's like 2 students' tuition. It's a nothing. That's to emphasize one element of any number of other elements, most of which you've drawn in here: historical, let's say, contribution and cultural memory, international relations, the very idea of community and what's happening in Camrose and what's happened to that campus, which has changed dramatically, as you know. That's to emphasize just one element, the financial. That's to say to the youth or to the students or to the university at large, we don't need to integrate other elements here. Our only concern is money, right? So then, if this speaks to a
and not much
a lack, yeah, and not even, I mean, not even one of those board members' salaries, assuredly, a year is negligible. How is that lack of integrity, the lack of the capacity to gather more than one thing and hold more than one thing in mind? What do you see as the trajectory of that? Do you think it's particular to let's say the Canadian provinces? Do you think it's a feature of the contemporary university in some way? You spoke about cultural, well, dementia is lovely. You've used the word amnesia before, but dementia is, it's like you can't articulate the things you should be able to recognize. They're right there, but you don't know what they are anymore, but they're still in your life.
Yeah.
And this is connected in my mind with your earlier mention that things have to be stripped away. Richness and difference have to be stripped away in order for something to be, let's say, manageable. You know, small enough for, not small, minor enough for a bureaucratic decision.
Yeah.
What do you see playing in there? Pardon me if that was a little bit long, but what do you see
Not
there, David, if any sense can be made? Or opening it up too for others. I mean, I'm assuming that most of everyone here has more experience on the ground or personally with these matters. I've visited and I've enjoyed and I've treasured in my mind more than once the place and the community you're talking about. The incapacity to integrate more than one thing, that it's amazing. But pardon me.
Yeah.
What do you think, David?
Well, Hannah Arendt, that great thinker of the 20th century, in her book, The Human Condition, but also flowing through her extraordinary work on totalitarianism and that extraordinary report she did on Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt saw the kind of trajectory of the modern world as being dangerously in the grip of a kind of bureaucratic normalization. And bureaucrats are really important. Good bureaucrats are really important. But it's odd. I mean, all my work life, I've certainly wondered about this. how those of us that get positions within institutions, positions of, not necessarily great importance, but modest value, how we can think about those positions as bureaucratic positions where we simply do the bidding as it emerges, and we see that, and we pass the paper along, and we don't think twice about what's done. Hannah Arendt calls this the banality of evil. My own sense is that I think that's infected all of us deeply. And so this act of integration that you talk about, of calling to mind a range of things that make life meaningful, a range of things that make life meaningful. Not simply letting real estate or the issue of finances run off with the picnic basket. Universities, 2 presidents ago at the University of Alberta, President Samarasekera, I remember when she called in all the deans. I talked with Roger about this and instructed them all that they were now responsible to raise a substantial percentage of funding that was needed for each of their bailiwicks. So this was an amazing thing to do. This alongside of course, launching various committees to try and green the university. So now to green the university, all of these deans had to travel all over the world by jet aircraft and use all the money necessary to raise money. It costs a lot of money to raise money. So these things are going in opposite directions, just opposite directions. And my sense, Andrew, is that it is so easy for people in institutions who have responsibility for those institutions to lose sight of what the purpose of the institution is. What is the institution's vocation? Why did that institution come about? And church, university, our forms of government, our legal systems. Why did they come about? And it takes no time at all. It takes no more than a generation. Every generation has to learn in its flesh the vocation of the institution that they are a part of. And if they don't, then the institution itself will no longer carry that vocation. It will become self-serving. The purpose will be simply to extend the institution, not to look at its local goodness. What does this institution really do well? But rather, how can it simply be extended? So this is a disease in the church. It's a disease in universities. It's certainly a disease in our political parties, in our governments. And when that happens, people within those institutions, because you see, the carrier of the vocation of institutions is rarely in the leadership of those institutions. Rather, it will be within the institution somewhere, and good leadership will discern where that is. And they'll call it forth. I saw this with Roger Epp, who, as the transitional dean and then the dean of Augustana when it became part of the University of Alberta, had a keen sense of Camrose. He was a Mennonite, so he was a little nervous about Norwegian Lutherans. and other Lutherans, because after all, you know, the 16th century had been pretty hard on his relatives. And he was pleased when I told him that I just read that the Canadian Lutheran, or the World Lutheran Federation, had finally apologized to the Anabaptists for the way in which they persecuted them in the 16th century. I remember doing that, just walking by the Ronning house with him one day and saying that I just read this, it had just been announced. And Roger got a funny little smile on his face, and he said, well, I will not say it is about time. So it's, Roger had a sense of that, had a sense of the place of Augustana within the community, the place of Augustana potentially within the university, the place of Augustana to do education differently. But of course, he got exhausted. And my own sense is that when there was that transition of power, Dean Berger is very fine administrator, lovely person, but the agenda was entirely different. And the inner circle at Augustana, which one would expect there would be some people that would actually carry that sense of vocation. What does this institution mean for students in terms of their formation? Not in terms of their education and their career, but in terms of their formation, their way of seeing the world. And I think some of the professoriate have had that, still do, I'm sure. What does this institution mean for Camrose, for this place that has been its womb, a place where the music program, for example, has added so much to the community at Camrose, where it's reaching out to other parts of the world to bring students in and to animate a relationship with those from afar and from other places. What does it mean to model a different kind of education, or are we simply, well, one more that's close to my heart. What does it mean as an institution which pulls forward the treasures of the past and the treasures of Western culture, not uncritically, but also as treasures, so that knowing your own gives you some ground upon which to richly engage the other. So when that is lost by those that hold the levers of power, what is left? Well, what's left is standard issues of finance and bureaucratic simplicity and my career. That's why Hannah Arendt, sitting there in Jerusalem after the first day of the Eichmann trial, said to her good friends, who she had known in Germany before the war, said to her good friends, Eichmann isn't the devil. He doesn't have that much existence. He's not even a person. She said, he's rump steak. He would just pass things along because he had no sense of what it meant to be German, what it meant to be part of an extraordinary culture that had been lost. Thomas Mann, he was in Switzerland when he got the letter from the rector of the university telling him he was no longer appointed could no longer use the various honorifics they had given to him. And he wrote back to him. And he said, "You don't even give me the courtesy of telling me your name. But maybe that's appropriate, because maybe you don't have one. You are simply serving something which has nothing to do with who we are." So my sense is the question of local goodness is such a significant one. And certainly in my time there with all of you around the Ronning Center, I saw so much of that local goodness. And I'm sure it remains. But it is odd when you get this separation of a lived sense of that from those who lead our institutions. There is a sadness in that. But it is not the end. Is there anyone else who would like to say something? Or I would like to finish with a psalm, since it seems appropriate for a requiem. Anyone else? Or
maybe I'll just add just a few words, because I feel a lot of what you have to say, being part of that bureaucratic system myself.
I saw you struggle with it, Harry.
Yeah, I did.
And that struggle is holy. That struggle is holy.
But it takes a long time to learn. And I have studied so much throughout my life, especially in history and whatnot. But it's only been since I've been retired that I have realized a lot of the things that I'm trying to pass on now to young people like my grandchildren, who will generally not listen. But I look back and regret, but like, for instance, with this Chester Ronning House, I mean, I was on the Senate of the university. I have had a great interest in Augustana, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
And I was flabbergasted when I saw the house bulldozed. I was surprised that we knew nothing about it. And I'm close to the university. And I knew nothing about this happening. It sort of flabbergasted me about what you say about bureaucracy and how deadening in many ways. It's really true. Anyway, that's enough.
So I'd like to finish with Psalm 77, a version of it by an American rabbi based on a Hasidic rabbi's take on it in the 17th century. And it is in a sense, it is a psalm related to grief and to taking those matters of grief and sorrow seriously, but also what it means to turn. I read this psalm. I was asked by Wendy Cassidy to give shape to her funeral because she had made a decision. She suffered terribly from COPD. And when the end came, she made a decision about how that end would be. And she had become a devout Catholic, and she didn't think that because of that decision, it would be possible for her to be buried through the Catholic Church. And then she said, "Oh, we thought about this, David, and then we thought, oh, you will come and do this." And I said, "Of course I will come and do it with you." So she left this world, and we gathered and had a funeral for her on the 11th of May, 2018. But I think it's more than just personal passing. It's also the other kind of passings in our life, and speaks a bit to our stance, being present to them, and open. When I cry, my voice trembles with fear. When I call out, it cracks with anger. How can I greet the dawn with song when darkness eclipses the rising sun? To whom shall I turn when the clouds of the present eclipse? Turn me around to yesterday, that I may be consoled by its memories. Were not the seas split asunder? Did we not walk together through the waters to the dry side? Did we not bless the bread that came forth from the heavens? Did your voice not reach my ears and direct my wanderings? The waters, the lightning, the thunder remind me of yesterday's triumphs. Let the past offer proof of tomorrow. Let it be my comforter and guarantor. I have been here before, known the fright, and found the companionship. I enter the sanctuary again to await the echo of your promise. Thank you for coming, and more than everything, for the time we spent in that 600 square foot simple house, which should have, for no other reason, stood as witness to simplicity and modesty and how to live well. So good to see you all.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Bye-bye.